Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do a retrospective on a Booktube darling, that book being Vicious and Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. But more specifically, we're referring to Vicious with the label of Booktube darling, as Vengeful actually had some mixed reviews when it initially came out. I was one of the individuals, because this is a reread for me, that enjoyed both of them quite a lot, and I remember at the time being kind of surprised by the reaction to Vengeful, because I didn't necessarily think that it veered off in such a different direction or writing style, or that it did anything to kind of ruin some of the characters from a previous book. So I was surprised that it seemed as though a lot of people, the general consensus was, oh, the second one isn't nearly as good. I am going to get into kind of the origin of this series and why it seems as though it's taken so long, first off, for even there to be a sequel to the first book, but also why it's taken so long for us to get our third book in this series. This is part of why I wanted to reread these, is because I wanted to prepare for that third book, remind myself of a lot of things, refresh, because it has been so long since I've read them. But additionally, I thought it'd be fun to do a look back, assess my feelings, how they've changed from when I first read these, or have they been kind of reaffirmed, and also just a reflection of how I think the perception of these two books has been. This is going to be a little bit more on the casual side, so between talking about the two books, I am going to have some clips of Luna Bear because she's adorable and precious. But also, before I talk about the books themselves, I do want to get into a little bit more some of what those general thoughts and feelings were, so that we have some context as I actually speak against them or in support of them. When I kind of first came into Booktube, I think V.E. Schwab overall was a Booktube darling as an author, where Shades of Magic, this is when it was really blowing up, and then Vicious, it was also really huge, and a lot of people actually were quite big fans of her archive series. This is an incomplete series, which we will get into that in a moment, but it in general was very well liked. Her works were very well liked. And I also really enjoyed them. I have always enjoyed V.E. Schwab's works. I like some more than others, certainly. For example, maybe Gallant isn't as high up for me. The Near Witch isn't as high up for me. But I do like Shades of Magic, Vicious, Vengeful. I like Addie LaRue, and I like Bury Our Bones, The Midnight Soil. So overall, I would say I'm a V.E. Schwab fan. But I don't know how many of you experience this, but whenever there's something that I have greatly enjoyed, and it's kind of solidified as like, oh yeah, I really liked that. The more time passes, the more I feel settled in my positive feelings for something, versus there's some books, maybe you have fun with them, or maybe you enjoy them in the moment, but then after a little bit, you're like, I didn't really like that part of that book, or it was fun, but didn't really sit with me. I didn't really have a lot of lasting feelings, and other things, the longer you sit with them, the more impactful they are to you. So for example, this happened recently for me with Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. I feel like the more I sat with that book, the more I quite liked it. But it had been, Vicious and Vengeful had pretty firmly been in my I enjoy this slot. Then I, over the years, have found that sometimes when you go back and reread things, you have this fear that you are actually going to discover that the thing that you enjoyed maybe in fact sucks, and that past you, it just has terrible taste. I don't like perpetuating this idea that if you're first getting back into reading, or if you've just never really been a reader and you're getting into reading for the first time, that you're incapable of assessing what you might like or dislike, so you're just going to be impressed by everything. I don't necessarily like that concept, but I also think there's something to the more that you read, the more certain tropes start to stand out to you, or the more certain thematic things, how they're executed. You'll see it from one book to the next, and you start to familiarize yourself with what makes something distinct, what makes something unique, what makes something stand out, versus what's kind of settled within the genre and its staples, and maybe it's not doing anything new, but even within that, you can have things that, okay, it's not doing anything new, but it's doing it really well, versus it's not really bringing anything new to the table, and it's just fine. There's different means of approaching books after you've read a lot of them, especially if you've read a lot within a certain genre. So, having read not only a decent amount of V.E. Schwab, but having been a huge fantasy fan for years and coming back to Vicious and Vengeful, I was just nervous that I wouldn't like them as much. Also, the general consensus, I do think that maybe some of people's impressions for Vicious and Vengeful were affected by some of the misinformation that I think was going around about these books. So Vicious was marketed and read as, for a lot of people, a standalone when they picked up the first book. And people really loved it. And this was when standalones weren't as popular, because now standalones are much more common in fantasy. But when it was first coming onto the scene, it was series after series after series, and people were like, what's a good fantasy standalone? Or what's a good, at the very least, speculative standalone? And Vicious was one that so many people would recommend. It was also a great one for people who were just getting into the genre, and it has kind of that genre bend quality to it, where it has sort of this thriller mystery feel, and then also there's almost like a comic book quality to it. And then, of course, you have like the sci-fantasy element. I almost think it's more science fiction, if we're going to label it under the science fiction fantasy umbrella. But regardless, it was doing a lot of things that made it really appealing to a lot of people. I think this was also coming out at a time where there were a lot of series that were getting random prequels or random extras or even continuations to series. At that time, it felt like so many books were doing that. And people, I think, were tired of what felt like we can't just let a great series or story be. We kind of always have to cash in for the next thing and almost feed off of the fandom, I think was the feeling, which that hasn't necessarily gone away. I think there are plenty of times that some of us look at something and we're like, did we really need this? I think that was kind of in the air at that time as well. However, the part about Vicious being a standalone that a lot of us were unaware of is the fact that part of why it was written so it could be read as a standalone was because of some of V.E. Schwab's first works, the Archive series. I mentioned this earlier. I said we'd be returning to it, so this is some of the explanation to that. The Archive series, it didn't have a good publishing journey. Something that can happen in publishing, and it's devastating for authors, is that you have a lot of times an advance that you make on your stories. And if you don't, within sales, make that back, then you don't then earn royalties on that. That's a big hurdle for a lot of new authors to get past. So it's not like right when a book comes out, the author is immediately earning royalties. They have to make back whatever their advance was first, most of the time, before they start earning on that. When they don't, what can happen is that publishers, or even maybe they do, but not at a rate the publisher was hoping for, what publishers can do if it's a series is they can kind of almost like put it on lock. They can kind of freeze it. They will decide that they're no longer going to put out the rest of the series because they don't feel like the series is earning them enough money, but they won't give the series back over to the author until their contract has run out. So what can happen is that then from that point, the author just has to sit on it. They can't self-publish it because sometimes that goes against their contracts. They can't really try to get a different publisher. That definitely would go against their contract. So they just have to wait until they're able to get it back. What typically goes down in those scenarios is that readers, they're twiddling their thumbs, waiting. When are we going to get the next book? When are we going to get the next book? And it becomes known, oh, I like the series, but there's no end in sight, so maybe don't give it a try, don't start it. And that only makes the sales worse. So then we're twiddling our thumbs, the author is twiddling their thumbs, and eventually the books are no longer, sometimes even in stores, they're no longer on the shelves. So by the time that the author has the rights back to their series, that series is dead. There's really no traction for it, nobody's reading it, nobody's asking for it. And if this is early in an author's career, this is especially difficult to get over, because one, there's the literal emotional side of things where you just feel so defeated. It takes a lot to put yourself back out there and to try and trust publishing again, or you can try the self-publishing route. But if you were known as that person who was traditionally published and then you went self-pub, but you never had a lot of success with traditional, there's an impression that readers will have, whether it's accurate or not, like, oh, well, maybe their books weren't that good and that's why they had to go self. There's just a lot that is unfair about those situations, and it's happened to quite a few authors. This happened with V.E. Schwab's Archive series, a version of this. There are specifics that are going to change from one author to the next when it comes to these sorts of scenarios, but this is essentially what happened with the Archive series. Because the Archive series wasn't written as, oh, you can read this one book all by itself and there's nothing that makes it seem as though there's another book in the series, that meant it couldn't even be read as a standalone. It was under the impression of, for a lot of readers, this is a series with no end in sight. So then People don't want to read something that seems like it's never going to be complete. It's why The Rhythmatist, as another example, by Brandon Sanderson. A lot of people like it, but they're like, I don't know if he's ever finishing that. So a lot of people don't really recommend it, the same as they would with something like the Mistborn eras or the Stormlight Archive eras. They're quicker to recommend those because Sanderson is open about like, oh, I'm working on those. Rhythmatist, there's rarely ever updates on that. It just kind of seems like it's going to get passed off to another author. So when those sorts of situations happen, the lesson, or one of the lessons that authors will learn from this, or advice from an agent, an editor, a publisher moving forward, advice will sometimes be, if you're writing a series, write the first one as if it's a standalone, or at the very least make it stand on its own so that you can have that one set aside, readers can pick it up, it's a one and done, and then we can move on. Possibly if you start to build in your career, then we can build trust in the readership, we can start other series, then we can go back to that one eventually if need be, and from there, you can try to come back to it and finish out the series, because she always had in mind, this is the part a lot of us don't know, she always had in mind that story, Vicious, Vengeful, and Victorious, that it would always be those three. The villain series would be a trilogy. So she wrote the first book, though, as a standalone, in part because of everything that had happened in her publishing career up through that point. And it did work really nicely as a standalone. There definitely are things within it that you think, she could come back to this if she wanted. And so she did, because she always planned to, with Vengeful. However, the impression at the time when it came out, no matter how many times she said it or other people were like, no, she said this, the impression was that she just wanted to make money off of it, that it was a cash grab, she should have left it as a standalone. And I remember feeling kind of devastated by that, because to have gone through everything she went through, after all of that, you're like, oh man, that sucks. So I don't know if maybe when it came out, if that impression colored how people felt about the second one or not. And then on the flip side, for people that did know, I was one of the people that knew that this was the situation. So you could argue that it gave me bias in the other direction, where I was more inclined to see it as a valid sequel, and then I kind of had my own impression going into it. But as much as we all try to not allow those things to affect us when we go in, I do think it created a strange setting for the release of that book. I don't actually know, though, what the feelings around Vicious and Vengeful are these days. I knew what they were when they were coming out at the time. But as far as what people feel on Booktube, what people feel on Book Talk about these books, I don't actually know. But that's kind of the context. So I wanted to now revisit it, having no idea what people think now, and be able to assess my own feelings and to be able to comment on, do I feel like I was going in with too much bias at the time, favorable bias, or do I feel like maybe others were coming in with unfavorable biases? I can't know that with certainty, but I can comment at the very least on how I feel like it was written and how it turned out in comparison to what the general consensus was at that time. So let's go ahead, and now that we finally have all of that context established, let's go ahead and talk about Vicious.
Luna, it's okay, Bear. I know fireworks are scary. Luna? 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 Oh, you want a French fry? Yeah.
If you don't know that much about Vicious and you've never really heard very many people talk about it, the setup for it is that in present day, you follow a man named Victor who is determined to get revenge against a man named Eli. And in the past, you see that these two were best friends and roommates. So you're wondering what happened between the two of them that created the situation. But it's not just past and present. It is also a fractured timeline. So you are not looking at one timeline in the present day and one timeline in the past, you are all over the place and you are exploring these different points in time, and then toward the end it all comes crashing together, and it also makes for certain reveals that hit in different ways because of the fact that you're not telling things in a linear fashion. I remember that I thought this was so cool the way it was told when I read it, and coming back to it, I still really like it. I was really impressed with how seamless it was. I was a little nervous that when I would come back to it, it would feel maybe gimmicky or that it would feel clunky. I didn't think that at all. In fact, it almost doesn't even feel like it's fractured, because the thing that kind of connects all these, the threads, if you think of it as that Charlie Day meme of all of the lines connecting everything, it always goes in a direction that I think as a reader, it's like it knows intuitively what you want to know. So I think she does a great job with the pacing and the intrigue building in this. She delivers information to you really efficiently. And, you know, you're starting to get questions. You see characters in the background and you're like, well, what's their story? What happened with them? And you get this little tiny section about when they met. And you're like, okay, so that's when they met. But then what about later? Like, why are they now working together? Or why, who's this person? That person was mentioned in the past over here, but now they were brought up with this character over here, so how did that happen? Anytime those questions start to form, because you of course have your initial A plot, and you're getting information about those. I'm going to stop doing this. You get information about those, and then B plot kind of sneaks in, and you're like, oh, I'm curious about that. And then you get information about those things. So I loved the fractured timeline in this. It was really creative. It was really, really well done, I thought. And it's interesting because V. Schwab, I think as her career has progressed, she has leaned a little bit more into these kind of contemplative stories, these stories of introspection, reflection, and descent. As an example, I think Addie LaRue is absolutely more of a, you could say, navel-gazing kind of book. And certainly it works for some people and does not work as much for others. But it is very much I want to just consider the questions of what it means to be a person and to be remembered and my place in the world. So it really, I don't want to go as far as say it takes itself very seriously, but it's not casual. I wouldn't say it's having the most amount of fun, and it doesn't need to. I just think it's a different kind of story. And then with something like Bury Our Bones, that is a story about descent. So it's less that it's contemplative and it's more like you're dwelling and sinking. And I do enjoy that about both of those. But Vicious is just so efficient and succinct. It's really good at just pushing things forward. And I'm trying to think of all of her books. This might be the one that would transfer into an adaptation the best, because absolutely I could see it having this like episodic structure. It invites you to kind of lean in and pay attention because of the fractured timeline, but I wouldn't say it's so complicated that you have no idea what's going on. It just has a way of really moving everything forward, but without losing out on the I was going to say the care you have for the characters, but that might not be the right way to put it. Because I don't know that I come away loving these characters. I find myself not wanting to look away is probably a better means of describing that. And then there are some there's one side character in particular that is incredibly lovable. Mitch, that character. And the dog. I love the dog as well. But I really, really enjoyed that first book. And another reason why, and we'll get into Vengeful in a moment, but another reason why I like this as a series as well is because the first book really is kind of about Victor and Eli, but it's more about them in the context of this fractured timeline. You don't really get as much into what makes them the way they are, and then what has led them to the mindsets they have. Instead, it gives you these tiny, tiny pieces of information about them, and you have these question marks, and then it doesn't go into those as much. So it builds this intrigue around them. And the thing is, you don't need to go into those things in order for the plot to still make sense and be satisfactory. It absolutely is, but you kind of were like, I feel like there was something with that, though. An example is that at one point, Eli has these scars on his back, and the other character asks, like, what happened? And they say, oh, and they say something. I won't say what it is in case you consider that a spoiler, but they say, and the other character's like, oh, I'm really sorry. And you're like, wait, but what happened there? I want more specifics about that event. I feel like that has to mean something, right? So you have these moments where you think, I feel like there's something there. So when a character has certain motivations for why they think the way they think or why they do the things they do, you are tying it back to these tiny pieces, which is really exciting. And then in Vengeful, some of those things actually get opened back up, which is a little scary, I think, from an author's end, because authors know their characters oftentimes quite well, especially if you've had them in your head and you've plotted out their stories years in advance. And since she always wanted this to be a series, she definitely did. So I can only imagine the restraint that V.E. Schwab had to have in writing Vicious to know, like, I can't tell them all, even though I have to write this as a standalone, just in case it doesn't work and I have another archive series situation. Even though I want readers to know these characters the way I know these characters, it doesn't serve this first book to go into all of that. And I think that's a sign of a mature author, because you do want to leave some breadcrumbs for the readers as they go into the following books, the following installments, and she succeeded in that, I think, very, very well. I'm trying to think of what maybe would not work as much for other people, and the biggest thing is that it isn't a story that is beautiful. It doesn't necessarily have the most rootable characters. She does have certain things she likes to explore, and one of those things she likes to explore happens to be the kind of edgier character types, and that's not for everyone. Some readers want a character that is maybe not cookie cutter hero, but at least is someone that they can get behind and they feel like they want to be inspired by, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We all have different things that we gravitate toward. There's a reason that we have these heroic stories and we have grim, dark fantasy. It's because we just feel connected to, or we resonate with different things than some others, and that's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So if you are somebody that wants that sort of a character to root for, I think you more of are like, well, the one person is way worse, so I'm rooting for the one that's not as bad. But then there's also, she's good at this too, where you're like, but why are they like this though? And you almost don't want bad things to happen just because even though some of the characters are like objectively terrible, but you also at the same time are like, oh, but they're fascinating at the same time, so I kind of want to have them stick around. And it's almost like when there's a really great villain in a story, which no pun intended because this is called the villain series, but when there's a really great villain and you're like, well, what would the story be without them? You know, it's like Lex Luthor, Superman, what would they be without each other, sort of a question. So I think that she succeeds very well in this. And I think that's another thing that lends itself to having that tiny bit of, it evokes something related to comic books. I wouldn't say it is super comic booky by any means. There's something about it that creates that feeling in you. And I think it is because you have the adversary, that how do you have one without the other? And also, who really is the hero and who really is the villain? And that's a question that gets asked as we progress through the series. So on that note, we'll go ahead now and talk about Vengeful.
Luna, little bear, why are you peeking around the corner? Do you want some belly rubs? Oh, yeah? Do you want belly rubs? Okay, one moment. Oh, here, bear. Oh. Hi, sweet girl. Oh, hello. Hi, bear. You got your silly ears. Love you. Oh, yeah. Hey, Luna. Luna bear. Luna. Someone's ignoring me. What if I said Snacky? Oh, yeah, that you hear. Oh, okay, I guess you don't know your own name.
I want to provide one additional thing about Vengeful that I think possibly was why some people, because people have their personal reasons why it maybe didn't work for them as well as book one, and I don't want to give the impression that everybody simply was just thinking it was a money grab. I don't want to give that impression whatsoever. I think that if you really loved the way that the certain characters in the first book were explored and that adversary, villain, hero dynamic, or maybe it's just villain, but you root for one over the other. If you really loved that about book one, book two expands and it becomes a little bit less that. I don't think it loses the feel. I think that V.E. Schwab still very well wove in a fractured timeline. And once again, it didn't feel like, oh, we're doing this again, because I could understand where some people, if it was not done well, then you'd be irritated to have that layout for the second book. I personally think that that layout was done great in the sequel. So I do think, though, that if you missed having that and having those two characters be the central focus, that sort of these are the two characters and all the fractured pieces are surrounding them and are connected to them, I can see why expanding would almost bum you out a little bit, because it's not as focused maybe as the first book, but I still think it packs a punch. So you are introduced to some new characters, and there are characters that were mentioned in the first book that become bigger players in the second book, and kind of the implications on much bigger things are present in the second book. And I don't want to say too much in case you do want to pick up the first book, you want to pick up the series. I don't want to give away too many of what those things could mean or where certain things would go. But you ask certain questions about after reading the first book or while you're reading the first book, like, well, what would happen if? And then now we're kind of looking at, yeah, let's actually look at what would happen. There is still this feeling, though, in the second one of how is everything going to play out so that we have another showdown. I think that's another feeling you have while reading this. I think it helps if you know ahead of time that you are broadening a little bit, because, yeah, you're not going to get as much of them. I don't want to say who specifically, because, again, I don't want to ruin anything. But I think, though, as you read, you're like, somehow the plot will conspire to have that face-off at some point. I like that anticipation as you read. I also really was shocked, because it's been so long since I've read these, I was shocked at how well I still remembered them. And I think that speaks to them having a level of, to put it simply, they have this iconic feel to them. Some people, I think, could come away from this with the idea that they are caricatures in a sense. I wouldn't agree with that, but I could see why somebody would feel that way. So you do have larger-than-life characters, certainly. They're not really understated. But I really found that I didn't just remember them. I remembered the beats of the story. I remembered a lot of their backstories. I remembered some specific scenes really vividly. So coming back to it was actually really fun. I was having a blast coming back to these. And the second one, like the first one, it really moves. It does... In the part I was talking about with Vicious, where I was saying you have breadcrumbs, and then you allow the reader to discover more as we progress through. As a result, that did mean that the second book, it does take its time to kind of tell you a little bit more about this character, get into their head a little bit more, questions that you had from the first one. Okay, now we're opening that door and we're actually taking a look through. You do have that, so it does mean that it feels a little slower for a while. But then once the ball really gets rolling, it has what I always kind of refer to as the race to the finish line feel. It just really picks up and carries you through to the end. And I have many questions about what is going to happen in that third book. I'm very excited. I can't wait. So my overall feelings about these is I think I liked them more than I did the first time. And I liked them the first time. But maybe it's because I had that fear of, I won't like this as much, and oh, everybody was probably right, it probably isn't as good, or I don't know, maybe I had that in my head, and so because I liked it at least just as much, that meant it was actually higher than what I was going in with. Either way, regardless of what possible biases were swirling around in my head or what expectations I had such a good time with these. I miss these characters. I miss this fun, fast-paced, vicious, over-the-top story. I loved it. I had such a good time with it. I can't wait for the next one. I had a blast. And if you are somebody who you maybe tried V. Schwab here and there, different V. Schwab books work for different people. So Vicious is the one that if you have tried maybe like Addie LaRue and Shades of Magic, those weren't for you, you didn't like either of them, I would say try Vicious, because I think that Shades is like her high fantasy, and it maybe isn't as high fantasy as some high fantasy fans wish it was. And it's also maybe not low fantasy enough for people who prefer things that are maybe not as epic in scope. It kind of sits somewhere in between. And you would think that would mean it had a broader reach, but actually I feel like these days it has the opposite. And then Addie LaRue, it's just so melancholy and, oh, what do I... Am I even real if no one remembers me? And some people are like, oh, who cares? Like, some people are like, I do something, make something happen. They don't like the, let me just stare at my navel for the whole book and wring my hands. And that's not their kind of story, which I'm oversimplifying that story. It has much more to offer than what I'm making it seem like. But regardless, I mean, I think it's fair if you wish the high fantasy was more intense or less. And I think it's fair if Addie LaRue, you're like, come on, something. This is gonna have something. It's fun, it's explosive, it's dynamic, the characters are addictive, and they are obsessed with each other, and that, like, unhealthy obsession I think is really fun to read about. It's a mess, and it's great. They're a mess, I should say. The book is arranged well. So, if you have tried V. Schwab, hasn't really worked for you, you might like Vicious. And then if you're a huge fan of V. Schwab and you just haven't given this one a try because you've been waiting for the series to wrap up, now I feel like is the time, because it's almost upon us. That third book is almost here. Now, if you like this style of video, I'm happy to do it again, either for things that would be rereads for me, or I think it could be fun to look at things in the past that had a certain, very distinct impression on Booktube, or very opposing views. Like, some people loved it, some people hated it. Even if I haven't read them, it could be kind of fun to go back and see, like, okay, now that enough time has passed and I'm coming to the table, let me see what I think of this. And then also I can kind of comment on the commentary, if you will. So I think that could be really fun. I think that could be interesting. And if you would like that, then feel free to give me some recommendations for things. Like, I think the Raven Boys, I could absolutely do something for that, because I know people really love that series. Anything that you can think of that you think would be fun to have this kind of dynamic for, I'd be happy to do so. But anyway, let me know if you're planning on picking up Vicious and Vengeful. If you have picked it up, let me know your thoughts. If you were somebody that remembers the conversations happening at that time, what are your impressions of it looking back? Are you planning to reread them before the third one comes out? Just let me know all your thoughts about this. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.